What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Um, just want to go ahead and finish off the series of videos I've been doing. So, just to recap, at number 10, the small forward position, I had James Worthy, number 9, Dominic Wilkins, number 8, Scottie Pippen, number 7, Rick Barry, number 6, I had Elgin Baylor, number 5, I had John Havlicek, at number 4, Kevin Durant, and number 3, Julius Irving. So, at number 2, I have the former number 1 pick at the small forward position, Larry Bird. All right, so Larry Bird drops down from number 1 to number 2 in my estimation. All right, some people still have him, as the best overall small forward. I guess maybe they're going peak for peak. Um, you know, it is what it is with Larry Bird. Um, I mean, he has a tremendous resume, especially considering the fact that he didn't have the longest career due to health issues. He was a three-time NBA champion, of course, three-time league MVP. He appeared in 5 NBA finals. In his career, he scored over 21,000 career points, I believe. He had career averages of 24 points, over 10 rebounds, and over 6 assists per game. So he was an all-around player. He could do pretty much everything on the court. He was a great shooter, but more a all-around shooter than just a three-point shooter. Um, his 37.6% career three-point percentage doesn't necessarily stand out today. It's a little bit better than average. For his time, it was much higher than the NBA average, though. And I think that's what you got to take into consideration. When Larry Bird was in his prime in the mid 80s, I think the average three-point percentage for people who took the three, it was around 27, 28%. So he shot it a lot better. Also, I think people have to take this into consideration. When you look at Larry Bird's career, outside of his rookie year, when he did shoot it a lot for that era, from 1980 until 85, he really eschewed that shot. He didn't take it a lot. He didn't really start shooting the three-point shot again until around 1984, 85, and then for the rest of his career. Between 1980 and 85, when he would shoot it, it was more situations where the shot clock was running down or he was being doubled, he had to force something up from outside, or that's why his percentages were a little bit lower then. Really, I think he was closer to a 40% three-point shooter. If you take, I know it's nitpicking and like taking away, and I'm but it could have, should have, but he was more of a 40% three-point shooter. But for his career, he shot 49.6% from the floor, 37.6% from the three-point range, and I believe 88.6% from the foul line. So he's one of the great shooters overall in NBA history. Um, when it comes to the comparisons between him and Magic, I would rank Magic ahead of him just because Magic had a longer, uh, prime period. Magic, before the HIV diagnosis, was still going strong, whereas Larry Bird, after 1988, began to slowly break down. Um, you know, even though he was going to play 4 more years, he was just a shell of himself. Um, but multiple time All Star. He was the game's clutch performer during his years in the NBA 1980s, and he's considered arguably, maybe the best player in the 1980s. I mean, I know some people will say Michael Jordan, but when you look at the league-wide perception in the 80s, the two top players usually mentioned were Magic and Larry. And a lot of people, I think, feared Larry more because when you compare Magic and Larry, um, neither one of them were lockdown defenders. Although Bird was a great help defender. What Bird lacked in speed and quickness, he made up for in guile and savvy and court awareness, basketball IQ, one of the highest basketball IQs in the history of the NBA, hustle, um, leadership, toughness, grit, um, all those things you could think of. And he just had that drive that you rarely see in most athletes. and he didn't have the typical, um, I don't want to say typical because a lot of white athletes have come from harsh upbringing. Jerry West too, but there is something to that. I've noticed that athletes that come from tough beginnings, um, they tend to have this drive about them that other athletes may not quite have. Athletes that seem to come from well-to-do families, you know, didn't really struggle in life. A lot of times they tend to lack that extra gear. That's not always the case. Kobe Bryant came from, a pretty good, a very good upbringing. Didn't struggle, but he had that thing. But Larry Bird was truly something phenomenal, man. He was the most feared player in the NBA in the 1980s. Um, it's just that he didn't have the longest health. He really only had about 9 years of stellar play. And he brought the Boston Celtics back to preeminence in the NBA in the 1980s. So, Larry Bird was born in French Lick, Indiana in 1956. His father, I believe, you know, um, was a difficult man. Um, you know, it wasn't a traditional loving family. I think his father worked in was it a coal mine? I think he was a coal miner. I forgot exactly what he did, but I know Bird used to talk about how years of working that type of menial labor job took its toll on his father's body, and basically had a foot that had broken that never healed correctly. And basically, he got to this routine where, he worked Monday through Friday, and Saturday and Sunday, he basically rested his foot, which had never healed correctly. And, you know, they would help his father get his boot on this foot that was, not really, you know, it really didn't heal correctly. It was always in pain. And that his father basically suffered from manic depression and suicidal depression. I know he said eventually his father committed suicide, which I'm pretty sure had a terrible impact on him. I think it happened when he was like 17 or 18 years old, Larry Bird. Larry Bird as a kid, um, from what I remember reading, was kind of quiet, I guess, awkward, shy. Um, but he took an interest in basketball young. Um, it's interesting to me knowing that he grew up in Indiana um, in the 1960s, and you know it would be very easy for a guy like Larry Bird, a white kid growing up in that era, to be a seething Ty Cobb like racist. But it didn't seem to happen to him. Um, for some reason, he never seemed to be obsessed with race. He didn't focus on that, and he grew up playing against black players. I think when he was 12 years old, he was playing against older, predominantly black teenage kids, and that kind of gave Bird that sort of game he had. Like I always say this, like I'm being very politically incorrect when I'm saying this. One of the things that make Luka Doncic appealing right now, as opposed to a Dirk Nowitzki or Steve Nash, Nash had a little bit too, but Luka has that nigger in his game. If you know what I mean, right? He has that nigger in his game that Larry Bird had. And, Bird didn't play the game like a typical white guy, if you know what I mean by that. You know what I'm saying? There was a meanness to his game. Um, so anyway, I digress a little bit, but that's what helped to elevate Larry Bird's skills. He shot constantly the basketball, shooting to the point where, he became an excellent all around shooter with, as far as shooting the basketball. Um, I think in high school, that's when he developed his passing ability. He was always a really good rebounder. I mean, he was taller than average. I think he reached his full height of 6 foot 9.5. I think by the time he was a senior in high school, but he really developed as a basketball player in high school. So after high school, um, I think initially uh, he was sort of trying to go by memory here. I believe initially he tried out. It was interested in Indiana University with Bobby Knight, but I don't think that Bobby Knight fit with him very well. I don't think he liked Bobby Knight's personality. I think what happened is, I believe he dropped out of Indiana, and I think that briefly, he wasn't in college. I think he did, for a brief period of time, was a laborer. I think he did drive a trash truck or something like that. But then he went back to school. I think he went to Indiana State. Okay, and that's where he starred for many years in Indiana State University. That's where he made a name for himself, and that's where he became a star with Indiana State. And of course, everybody knows and remembers that epic uh, NCAA title game in 1979 between Bird's Indiana State team and Magic Johnson's uh, Michigan State team. And ultimately, Magic Johnson won that title. That's something that Larry Bird never really got over, losing that title game. And after his tenure with Indiana State, that's when Larry Bird went to play for the Boston Celtics. Now, actually, Larry Bird was drafted, I believe, in 1978. They had his rights, but they waited a year until he actually began to play for them. And it's interesting because he came this close to playing with John Havlicek. Um, John Havlicek retired in 1978. He was 36 years old, but it would have been interesting to see how it would have meshed to have Larry Bird, who would be the tie-in to the new generation, playing with the last link to the Bill Russell Boston Celtics, John Havlicek. But Larry Bird came into a team that really struggled after Havlicek left. It's interesting. After he left the 1978-79 season, I think Boston went something like, what was it, 29-53. Terrible. Missed the playoffs, of course. But then Bird got there. They turned around 32 games. They went 61-21. And while they didn't win the championship his first year, Magic Johnson and Lakers did. When Magic had tremendous, performance in the finals with Kareem's absence, Bird did win a consolation prize of winning Rookie of the Year. And it's Magic and Bird helped to usher in a new era with a new narrative. Prior to them, the NBA was struggling. Now, Dr. J, as I said earlier, was helping to keep the NBA afloat, but it was Magic and Larry Bird that really ushered in a new era of success and new fans, millions of new fans into the NBA. Like I was going to say, the narrative was changing from, you know, drug usage, not the best actual basketball play, uh, you know, troubled NBA players, stars that really couldn't connect with the average fan. Now, of course, you had Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, of course, their rivalry. There, of course, was that racial aspect to it, of course, that's going to attract fans. But then you had other stars. You had Alex English, Adrian Dantley, George Gervin, Julius Erving was still there, of course. Moses Malone, Isaiah Thomas, if I haven't said him yet. Mark Aguirre, high scoring forward, Tom Chambers. The league was littered with, you know, players that were stars. Terry Cummings, um, James Worthy, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, of course. So this was a star-studded NBA. But the star of stars were Magic Johnson and, of course, Larry Bird. In 1980-81, Boston would come back from a 3-1 deficit in the Eastern Conference Finals to make it to the NBA against the Philadelphia 76ers. In the finals, they defeated an outmanned Houston team that somehow got to the NBA Finals despite a losing in 40-42 record. And Larry Bird won his first NBA championship in 1981. One thing I want to add too is I can't remember exactly when it happened, but I think it happened earlier in his NBA career. I think he was playing a softball game, and Bird suffered an injury where he mangled uh, a finger on his shooting hand. It bent back, and it never really healed correctly. It never straightened out, and it always affected, he said, his shooting. He said afterwards he never was as good a shooter as he was prior to that injury, which is amazing considering the shooting numbers that he put up afterward. But I just wanted to note that too. So 1982 rolls around. Uh, Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics have a great season. I think that's the year though that they were swept out of the playoffs by the Milwaukee Bucks. I think it was in the semifinals. All right. So 1983 rolls around, and that's the year that the Philadelphia 76ers, who acquired Moses Malone, just romped through the NBA and won a championship, which would be Julius Erving's and Moses Malone's only championship. So 1984 comes around, all right? So when 1984 comes around, Magic at this time has two championships. Bird has one. And going into that series, the Lakers were favored. They were the better team. But Boston proved to be tougher. Boston proved to be, more resilient, and they wanted it more. Magic Johnson uncharacteristically had a poor finals performance by his standards. He made some bad decisions at times, as did guys like James Worthy with the basketball turnovers and such, and missed shots. So Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics rallied from a deficit in that series to win in seven. So now it was tied at 2-2. Now the narrative was beginning to change a little bit as far as who was the better player. The mid '80s, it was Larry Bird's period of time. 1985, they were the defending champions. Most people would argue that the '85 Celtics were a little bit better than the '84 Celtics. Kevin McHale was beginning to emerge as a force. I believe that's the first year he was induced into the starting lineup, and that changed the whole dynamic of that team. And that's when you saw the real talk about the greatest front line ever. Um, Bird won his second consecutive league MVP. He was at the top of his game. Now Bird was beginning to utilize a new weapon. It was popularizing a new weapon that the NBA was still shunning for a while. That was the three-point shot. Okay, so that particular season, I can't remember what he averaged. Might have been 27, 26. I can't remember his numbers like I used to, like per season, but he generally averaged around this time around, let's say 25 or 26, maybe 11 rebounds and maybe 6.5 assists or something like that. But at this point, this is when Bird really had established himself as the man, as the guy that people feared in the clutch. This is the guy that no matter what, how much time was left on the clock, no matter what situation, you always felt he was going to make the shot. Didn't always happen, but more often than not, he came through. Okay. In the finals that year, even though Boston decimated the Lakers in the first game of that series, often called the Boston Massacre or the Memorial Day Massacre, the Lakers went on to win that title after a motivated Kareem Abdul-Jabbar dominated after game two of that series and won Finals MVP. I believe he's the oldest man ever to win Finals MVP. But then came the '86 Celtics. The '86 Celtics, that's when they were at their absolute peak. Larry Bird was at the top of his game. Kevin McHale was at the top of his game. Robert Parrish was at the top of his game. For 1 year and 1 year only. Bill Walton was like Cal Ripken out there. He was like Lou Gehrig, the healthiest he had been in years. He's playing well. Six-man a year winner. Dennis Johnson was great. The bench was great. Seastings and all those guys. All those guys were great. Even Danny Ainge, as fucked up as I don't like him, Danny Ainge was emerging as another outside threat and a pretty decent, feisty defender. I don't got nothing like that, but he was just a guy that got on your fucking nerves. But the Boston Celtics went 67-15 that year, and Casey Jones and the boys was really dominating the league. They made it look easy. In the finals, they didn't have the dream matchup that you wanted. The Lakers were ousted by Houston. I think there was in the people keep reminding me. Sometimes I forget which round it was. Was the semis? I can't remember. Um, but ultimately, it was the Houston Rockets. Boston won in six, but it can be argued that if Hakeem Olajuwon had any help, because Ralph Sampson was poor in that series, maybe they could have made it a contest. That'd have been interesting. But it looked like afterward the league was going to be Boston. In the draft that year, they were able to get Len Bias, the best player in college. There were the Jordan comparisons with Len Bias at the time. It looked like for about a day and a half that the future was going to be the Boston Celtics. But then tragedy struck. Okay, we all remember what happened to Len Bias. He died of a cocaine overdose induced heart attack. And then just bad luck after bad luck for the franchise. First, the Len Bias death. Then players started getting injured on that team. Bird suffered injuries. Bill Walton suffered a foot fracture for the 59,000th time, and that eventually led to his retirement. Most notably, Kevin McHale. Kevin McHale, who was probably having the best season of his career in 86, 87, suffered that foot fracture, chose to play on it, and because he wanted to go for a championship. That probably robbed him of a couple of years of his career, and it definitely robbed him of his peak. Afterward, Kevin McHale was never the same player again. All right. They did make it to the finals. I remember them being 59-23 that year. They made a go at it, but that 87 Lakers team was the best team of the Showtime era, and Bird and the Celtics just couldn't quite do it. And then afterward, you saw a slow decline of the Boston Celtics. 87, 88, they were still a really good team. They made it to the Eastern Conference semifinals after a very spirited seven-game series against Atlanta Hawks. Game seven was the duel, of course, between Dominique Wilkins and Larry Bird. Uh, Dominique Wilkins won the scoring battle, but Larry Bird won the war, scoring 20 of his 34 points in the fourth quarter. But then this is when it really shit really began to hit the fan. In the Eastern Conference Finals against Detroit, Bird averaged only 10 points a game, which was probably, oh man, what was that? Almost 20 points below what his season scoring average was. He averaged 29.9 points per game during the regular season. The reason why he struggled so much, a lot of it had to do with Detroit's defense, but Bird was suffering from undiagnosed bone spurs, which he had surgery for, which caused him to miss, I think, all but 6 games of the 88-89 season. While at the same time, Bird was struggling with back issues. These back issues would predominantly become the main cause of his pain and agony. Okay. When Bird came back after the 89-90 season, it was pretty much, it was obvious to those who observed him that he was not the same player. Now, of course, they remained a really good team um, for the remainder of Larry Bird's tenure with them, but it appeared that their championship window had passed. Now, In 1991, by that time, Larry Bird had transitioned from being their primary scorer to being more of a playmaker. Um, Sometimes Bird was moved to the power forward position just because of the fact that he was slower. More forwards at that time were becoming more athletic, bigger, and stronger, so he was moved to the forward position. Um, and the thing about the 1991 season is that the Celtics started off as the best team in the NBA. You really saw the emergence of what's his name, Reggie Lewis. You really saw the emergence of a guy like him. You saw some really good play from other guys on that team. But after a 29-5 start, injuries began to affect that team, in particular Larry Bird, and they did finish 56-26. I remember that, but they weren't the same team they were earlier in the year. 91, 92, Bird only played 45 games that year, and I remember him being very inconsistent with his play. One night he might look a little bit like Larry Bird. He might drop 25 and three quarters, shoot the ball very well, play brilliantly. But then some nights he just looked like honestly like he didn't belong in the NBA anymore. Um, this is when Bird really was struggling. He had to wear a back brace at all times. Um, this is when he had to have his spine manipulated to be stable enough just to play basketball. This is also when Bird really was kind of taking a risk because if he got hit the wrong way, in any way, shape, or form, it was a possibility that he could literally become paralyzed. It wasn't a high risk. I mean, it wasn't a very high risk of that, but it's possible. But afterwards, I think Larry Bird decided, especially after Magic Johnson announced that he had AIDS, I think he decided in his mind it was going to be the last season. But before he retired, before he announced his retirement, he played. He had one last glorious moment, of course, on the '92 Olympic Dream Team. Okay, he didn't play much, but because of his achievements, because of what he meant to the game of basketball, he was on that team. And it was shortly after they won the gold medal in Barcelona. I believe it was August the 19th of 1992. Larry Bird, of course, announced his retirement from the NBA. Okay. Now, I could go into, his after NBA career, but I really just want to focus on basketball. We all know that he went on to coach the Indiana Pacers for 3 years with a great, great um, cast of associate coaches or assistant coaches. I remember one of them being Rick Carlisle. They took the Bulls to the limit in 1998 in the Eastern Conference Finals, and of course advancing to the NBA Finals in 2000 before losing in 6-2. That great Shaq and Kobe Laker team that went 67-15 that year. And he had many years as president of basketball operations with the Pacers. Um, but when you look at his NBA career, like I said before, he averaged 24.3 points, 10 rebounds, almost exactly, and 6.3 assists. We look at his accolades; they're tremendous. Three-time NBA champion, two-time NBA Finals MVP, 84 and 86. The only year that he won a championship that he didn't get Finals MVP was 81 when Cedric Cornbread Maxwell won it. And I believe that Maxwell and most likely Iguodala is going to be the other one are the only two Finals MVP winners to not be in the Hall of Fame. Three times his league MVP, 84, 85, and 86, three consecutive MVPs. 12-time NBA All-Star. He was 1982 All-Star Game MVP. 9-time All-NBA First Team. He did it 9 consecutive seasons. All-NBA Second Team, 1990. 3 times All-Defensive Second Team, 82 to 84. He was the 1979-80 Rookie of the Year. The NBA All-Rookie Team, 1979-1980. I forgot to mention this, of course. For 3 years in a row, he was the NBA three-point contest champion, sometimes winning that award in dramatic fashion. Twice he was a member of the 50-40-90 Club. He was the AP Athlete of the Year in 1986. He's on the NBA's 50th anniversary all-time team. His number 33 retired by the Boston Celtics, of course. And his number 32 retired by the Indiana State Sycamores. As a coach, he was the NBA All-Star Game head coach in 1998. And he was the NBA Coach of the Year in 1998. And as executive, he won the Executive Year Award with the Indiana Pacers in 2012. And of course, he won Olympic gold in 1992 with Barcelona. And I'm talking about, in my opinion, the second greatest small forward in NBA history, Larry Joe Bird.